Today I'm thinking about the autonomy of the individual. So as I'm actually thinking that thought, I'm really thinking about any individual that's ever lived. So if we go back in time to the first individuals, the individual, you might say, is the one living in the world. No, whether it's an Aboriginal tribal situation or a modern city dweller, as it were. No, I can imagine that any individual feels their autonomy regardless of, say, the wider society around them. Whatever the custom is, the tradition is, and even in the family, the individual grows up and feels its independence, feels its autonomy, even if it goes the wrong way, even if it breaks the rules, breaks the taboo. You know, it could be very negative, very positive, very good, very evil. It could be a criminal or somebody that serves society in a very ethical way. All of that is an expression of the individual, but the individual has within the organism, you might say, all kinds of psychic things that may have been inherited, and certainly characteristics of the parents, as well as, say, the instinctive level, where you have a sexual drive, emotional drive, and aggressive drive. So if you have two children, one's aggressive and one's an artist and lives a more passive life. Now, the society will have rules and regulations and make judgments about who's good and who's evil, and generally speaking, you would say the person that's acting out a more aggressive attitude in society, may be imposing that aggression on others, is more evil than the person that's living a quiet life, producing paintings and being quite modest in their life, in their behaviour. But objectively, given the autonomy of the human being, I would say there is no morality regarding whether you're aggressive or not. I think that comes later, that's imposed by the society you grow up in. And we do make judgments on each other and more or less condemn people that don't conform and who break the rules and break the taboos. So even if you're not aggressive, you can be quite rebellious, or you think thoughts that are censored, or you paint pictures, or have a philosophy that runs against the culture you're living in. And you might say the human right of the individual to be free, to be themselves, positively or negatively, good or evil, or whatever the conditioning is in a kind of quasi-natural state, and then the society comes in to organise the people so that things can be done within society, which requires rules and regulations, and you can understand the imposition on the individual freedom to be itself in a you might say, I suppose, amoral sense. And I think that kind of thing is in each of us, the sense of maybe anarchy at some level that we know we can break the rules, we know we can be very autonomous and individual, and maybe in our own way we do seek some kind of natural freedom. So a child, a teenager might deviate from the norm in their fashion, in the books they read, the people they mix with, what they get involved in, and various things. And a typical example of that is somebody getting involved in magic or the occult. So you get a real sense of like breaking the taboo and the censorship, say within a Christian society, for example. And the community really doesn't like people being too individualistic. And I suppose as long as you're seemingly serving the community, then you're allowed to do other things in private. So in the house you can do private things, you might say. Which are really in secret. And therefore you get the idea of hypocrisy in say, people that are well known and famous, and celebrities, politicians, religious people, when they're found out to be, as I say, more anarchic and breaking the taboo and being a bit evil and being a bit negative, which again may be their natural right, that they were born that way to express certain aggressive traits, all kinds of maybe karmic things that they brought over from another life, for example, or things passed down in their parents and their ancestors, all that kind of thing. And when they say they're working all week, and on the weekends they might be more gothic and let their hair down, as it were, and run wild, and maybe a bit destructive or something like that, or maybe practicing magical things and casting spells and all this kind of stuff. But just trying to express their natural freedom, their natural autonomy. It's the same way you could go in the army and then you're sent into a war zone where you can kill people. That would be another way of saying it. Or a lot of sport is competitive and self-assertive and aggressive. And so in a way, there's a lot of ways you kind of can conceal your negativity, your evil tendency, as it were, to deviate. And in society, certain things are allowed. You can get away with it. And then there are other things like crime that you can't get away with. You're not allowed to get away with. Or in certain periods of history, you can't get away with not going to the temple, or not going to the church, or not going to the mosque or synagogue. In bringing in the spiritual notion of the self, being distinct from individuality, or in the sense of identity, of a kind of ego-bound consciousness where you're living out various roles and complexes of the personality, projecting all kinds of behaviour and expressions. And with the self, in terms of spirituality, in my own case, prior to my awakening and making the distinction between self as an enlightened position, in an enlightened position, in nirvana as it were, my sense of individuality was essentially creative. I took philosophy, and I was allowed to be very creative within my philosophy course, and to think my own thoughts and make my own interpretations. And I was also expressing poetry and expressing art, doing modern art and modern poetry. And so I was very individualistic in my style, and I felt I could do anything I wanted to. So I didn't copy anybody or follow anything. I didn't even let other people know that I was doing poetry and art. And that's been the case most of my life, with spirituality as well. Most people haven't really known that I was involved in spirituality. And that sense of being an individual in society, making up your own mind whether you're going to break the taboo or not, do criminal things or not, break the moral code, deviate from the norm. I mean, I never thought of my life like that. I didn't kind of conceive of my life like that. I wasn't brought up religious, so I certainly didn't know about God and Jesus and the soul and good and evil or anything like that. I was just very secular, maybe more humanistic. And I just felt free. I felt within the society you were allowed to do pretty much what you wanted to do, long as you didn't become a criminal or something like that, and break the rules in an obvious way. And I did feel very liberated, extremely liberated. And then, you might say, after a couple of years of doing that, I then had a shift of consciousness, became very aware of the self in an enlightened state, and that enlightened state I experienced or felt to be a real sense of freedom. And it didn't interfere with my identity as a poet or an artist. There wasn't like a contradiction, there wasn't like a value judgment or anything like that. It was just like two distinct spheres of influence, you might say. And I didn't see spirituality in that sense as something moral. It wasn't like dogma or religious belief or religious behaviour. It's nothing to do with that. To me, it was all more existential. It's like an existential sense of freedom. And as a human being, then I started to read spiritual books, and then found a context for that state of mind that I didn't even know was spiritual. So it was just an absolutely, a sense of myself feeling free and in a state of oneness, and that was it. There was no activity, there was no thought, there was no memory, there was no purpose, there was no meaning. It was just that state. It was absolutely just that state. And I didn't at that time do poetry and do art. I just mixed with people into spirituality and such, and began to identify myself as a spiritual person. So you could say I did develop as an individual in the sense of having the identity of a spiritual person. Now, the identity as a spiritual person, like the artist and like the poet, as it were, that was quite different from being myself in freedom. It was like two different things. So the self in freedom, not having any thought or knowledge or memory, couldn't impose anything, I couldn't act from there on myself. I couldn't get, you might say, information that told me what to do in my consciousness as a spiritual person. So everything I did as a spiritual person came from my experience in the world of reading books, etc. And that was how I cultivated that over the years. Whereas the self was free, and that was it. I just was aware of myself as being free, and I have been like that for 50 years. And yet, very few people in my whole life have known that I was in a state of enlightenment. Only, in fact, I would say nobody has known. I mean, literally, I didn't share that fact with anybody. And so I just lived with people doing art, interested in spirituality, into the occult. I studied psychical research, all kinds of things psycho-spiritually. And none of that had any meaning to myself in freedom. When I say it didn't have any meaning, simply the self in freedom, there is no meaning. There's no cause, there's no purpose, there's no mission. There's no... The self in freedom doesn't do anything, so that those people in the world, this is how I would perceive it, those people in the world that people know to be spiritual and have set up organizations, that's all a product of consciousness. That doesn't tell you at all whether that person is actually enlightened. That has nothing to do with it. Now, if that person who's involved in a spiritual organization, for example, like Krishnamurti, that's the person I know quite well, and I've been involved in his organization or foundation and schools, they may communicate and they may write or talk, and in that you can discern through a comparative study of other texts whether you think that person is or isn't, say, like the Buddha, for example, or like some historical figure that's supposed to have been enlightened. But you can't really tell from what they say and what they write, but you can get some idea. So if there's a tradition of sacred text, then you get the flavour, you get the sense of it. But I wouldn't consciously try to make myself known, as it were, or think that I could make myself known in that enlightened state, because it's emptiness, it's nothing. And Lao Tzu says, those who know do not tell, those who tell do not know. And I think that's pretty good. So even from that simple statement, if you have experienced freedom and emptiness, and there is actually no thing, nothing to say, nothing to do, nothing to tell, then you get a fairly good idea of what that actually means. So in the world of identity and ego and consciousness and individuality and all of that, i.e. human condition, the human behaviour, then there will be contradictions, there will be hypocrisies, there will be self-deception, inevitably, because that's the realm of duality or opposites, always playing off against each other, whether it's in the family, the brother and sister, the father and mother. So you might say, in the world of society, by implication, every single individual is in some comparative behavioural relationship. It's inevitable. And then out of that you get the hierarchical structures in politics, religion and education and all the different compartments. And you'll get gradations of like good and evil, or gradations of success and failure, and all the competitive things. And that's just the way it seems to work. But self in freedom just looks on at your life and really is objective to that. It's objective to consciousness, is objective to the body, and objective to the psyche. It's just like what, you know, you're in a parental position of watching the child do what it does with the spiritual values and virtues of compassion, understanding, love, justice, order, and you just see. And what you know, if you have a child and they grow up to be this or that, you know, you reach a point whether you think you're going to abandon that child, in the sense of they're in opposition to you. And of course that's what every single individual does in relationship to the other. So two parents could feel that they can't live together, brother and sister may not like each other, two countries don't like each other, two religious organizations, two gurus, you know, all of that. And no surprise. So the self, yourself, watches your behaviour as an individual, as it were, as an identity, and if you're successful or not, whether you fail in what you're trying to do, maybe as a spiritual person you're trying to make an impression in the world, maybe you fail, maybe you're successful. But to self, in essence, it is not a concern of self whether it's not a concern of, say, myself, whether I'm a successful or a failure in any form of behaviour in the world. And probably the same for a mother. Whatever the child does, it's her child. I mean, institutions like the family and the country and the church and business and all of that, they want to survive. They're very tolerant. They put up with whatever they have to in order to survive. And if it means being aggressive, if it means being deceptive, if it means being hypocritical, then more or less every institution will play the game. Cut corners and deceive. And also, within the field of consciousness, there's no right way to do anything. It's only relatively right. There's no actual right way to do it. That's why dogma, belief, principles of any kind, philosophically or whatever, morally, they're arbitrary. They're just imposed upon the individual. And the very nature of the identity or individual is within that fragmentation, within that competitive field. So even if you feel you've been victimized, you're still a participant in that, because as soon as you have an advantage, then you will take that advantage and someone else will become the victim. Inevitably. So all the the opposites, as it were, the polarity of yin yang and that kind of thing will play itself out. That's what consciousness is, the field of duality, with relative unity, relative harmony, relative justice, relative love, relative freedom. And the self looks on and shrugs its shoulders, as it were. And if you're not self-aware, if you haven't discovered that, if that hasn't awakened in you, then it doesn't matter or mean anything to the individual, because the individual's just doing what they do. They're not like missing anything. I mean, you may, if you're a spiritual person, religious person, you might think that everybody should be awakened, be a better world, and things would work out, etc., etc. But then it wouldn't be a world anymore. It probably wouldn't be a human community anymore, full of individuals. But the world is like that. So I wouldn't spiritually make any statement about whether people should be enlightened or not. Because in that state of emptiness, as I just said, those who tell do not know, those who know do not tell, which also means you make no comment. You literally make no comment about other people's behaviour. That all takes place within consciousness. And the world of karma and consciousness that's living itself out is really, none of your business as a self-enlightened person. So when I'm doing my behaviour, when I'm living out, and getting involved with complicated relationships and all that, emotional and all kinds of things. I just do it. I'm not doing it looking over my shoulder at what myself is thinking and making judgments. I should be pure, I should be holy, I should be, because there's nothing to live up to. The self is free and that's it. And the one is the one, and whatever the one is doing cannot be known by consciousness. So you're not kind of responsible for being in the one. You're not responsible spiritually for being in the one, because the one is the one. I mean, you happen to be in the one, and other people are in the one, and the one is the one, and there's no specification. I mean, from my point of view, in the immanent sense, not the transcendent sense, but the immanent sense, there's no means of accessing any content that gives you any form of direction. So any spiritual person that is telling people what to do or what not to do, that's in consciousness. That has nothing to do with the absolute nature of the one, which the Zen refer to as self-nature, or the original face. So if I'm in relationship to somebody I feel intimate with, I feel close to, and there's contradiction or conflict or some kind of disharmony on a deep level in myself or in another person due to what we inherit, what might be the karma involved, I don't look at that other person from the position of the self. I look at that person as another, I look person to person within my identity and personality and consciousness, and relate through communication, feeling, knowledge, experience, all of that, and not bring in the self. I don't kind of bring in the self as like a holier than thou attitude. No, I've got to live out the reality of that very complicated personal relationship. There's no solution in the self, the one. The one may be working in its own way, who knows? But the self's freedom in the one, in nirvana, is of its own kind. The individual identity in terms of consciousness and karma and society is also in its own sphere. It's doing what it does. I mean, if I'm going to express myself as a painter and do some spontaneous image or something, that takes place in total freedom within consciousness. But I don't then refer it back to my sense of self in the one and think I can, how can I say, measure it or make a comment or reflect it. No, you can't do anything, there's nothing. But it's not schizophrenic, it's not a divided self. It's not, there's no psychological process going on between the two. If you have a politician that's doing their work, they're getting things done in the cabinet, in Parliament, and then they've got a mistress, or they've got something devious going on that society thinks is deviant, and then you accuse the person of being a hypocrite, that kind of thing. But the point being that, like the self and the identity, that person being a politician and that person having a mistress, in that person, in the reality of that person, they're so different. Those two things are so different. So I can understand how the two, you might say, ought not to be compared. I mean, it's like a scientist, if they're doing an investigation into the quantum field and is maybe quite aggressive in their behaviour in terms of relationship with other people, but it doesn't impact the idea that they're a good physicist. And you know, society could say, well, if you don't behave yourself, we're not going to let you do physics. Or if you don't behave yourself, we're not going to let you run a spiritual organization or something. But to the self, none of that matters. So in the true spiritual sense, none of that matters. So I wouldn't say that what goes on in consciousness is spiritual. And I think you can only say that about the spiritual. I think everything else within society, within the institutions of politics, philosophy, every other subject, every other aspect of culture is fully conditioned by consciousness, whereas the spiritual is the only thing that's not conditioned by consciousness. The spiritual isn't part of consciousness, so it can't be conditioned by consciousness, and that's the only thing. And in a sense, when people in say the Christian church, they put God outside of the equation, you know, the God is outside somehow, and that's actually right. That is actually the right way to look at it. But the only thing is, they personalize God in the person of Jesus, say. They personalize God, and therefore they think there's a connection between God and the church. But in real terms, there's no connection between the one and the psychic and the physical and consciousness. There's no connection. So this idea of, say, the personality, which is the individual within society, the identity, the ego, and its projection onto the spiritual and personalizing the spiritual is a total misunderstanding and misconception and misrepresentation of those people who have established the institutions of religion. Like saying the Pope says, well, St. Peter is connected to Christ, or God has a mission on earth. Well, there would be no connection. That you can't do that. We're human, and we're in the human condition. We're in the karmic condition, and we're responsible, and our personality is conditioned by the psychic and the physical, etc. And the spiritual is something that stands apart, absolutely. There is no conduit or medium or bridge between the psychophysical and the spiritual. That doesn't mean to say the spiritual, the one, doesn't in its own way bring about, you might say, a coincidence or synchronicity between itself and the psychic and the physical and consciousness, which is, you might say, a mystery in the sense of you can't know that, because you can only know through your memory, through knowledge and consciousness. So as a self in freedom in the one, I can't know what I'm doing in the world. I can't actually know that. I mean, I can know from spiritual perception that I am, you might say, able to utilize spiritual perception in the way I look at consciousness and the world. But I can't necessarily know the effect of doing that, the effect of, say, perceiving with compassion or perceiving with insight or love or justice or truth. There may be effects, maybe there aren't effects, but I don't necessarily know that because it's not a matter of knowledge, it's a matter of wisdom. I mean, that's what freedom's all about. I mean, when I go for a walk down the river, I like to be open, I like to be in the one. I don't feel the need to communicate, I don't feel the need to record anything, to think about anything, to remember anything. So I like to be open and just look at the whole process as being one. And if I do focus, and if I do start to think and form an identity, and then I can communicate to somebody else, maybe I will, maybe I won't. So in the looking out of the oneness, you might say, the perceiving out of the oneness, if you're looking at the world with spiritual perception in terms of compassion, it's not a compassion being an aspect of the one isn't focused. I mean, it's simply compassion. So it's not like you can contextualize compassion. You can't locate it, you can't focus it. Like love and understanding and justice and that kind of thing. You know, order. It's non-specific. So that means you have compassion per se for the world. You have love for the world, truth for the world, you know, per se, as a whole, because the one, the spiritual, enfolds all that is, as it were. So if you went to another planet, it would go with you. Went to another dimension, it would go with you. It's not dependent on context, it's not dependent on consciousness or memory or location or identity. It's nothing to do with that. I mean, this is just my point of view. I'm just exploring very, very subtle ideas, but nonetheless I like to think things, even if they're very, very subtle, try to work things out, which I find interesting to do philosophically anyway. I mean, I had a dream of Hitler a few months ago. So I'm in a dream and Hitler's sitting in front of me, I'm standing, and I think he's got someone to his right, maybe like a nurse or something like that. Don't really know how to identify the person, but say it was a nurse. And I said to Hitler, "Hello, sir." And I sat to his left. And his face was quite grey looking. He seemed almost in a trance, like mumbling to himself, and seemed quite ill, quite dissociated, quite ill. And that's when the dream ended. But I would have been interested to talk to him. I would have been interested to relate to him without any image, without any judgment, without anything. And that's how I would be with any human being. Literally any human being. There's no fear, there's no judgment, nothing. And when self as one, using spiritual perception of compassion, understanding, there is no measurement, no division, no reason to have any particular attitude, because you're not within your consciousness. So, what does that mean? I mean, within consciousness, those people that deem Hitler to be evil wouldn't give him the time of day. They'd want to either kill him, lock him up for the rest of his life, etc. And that's the moral code, as it were. And what does that mean to stigmatize somebody as evil or mentally ill, or, you know, in a sense of not worthy of society, or because of their aggression, which is a natural instinct? I mean, you know, even Aboriginal tribes, they have their territory, they probably fight to the death to defend their territory, the survival of everything, and that kind of thing. So you could say in society, each individual at some level is out for themselves, to express themselves, to assert themselves, to take their position, get their house, get their territory, get their family, their country, etc., their institution, their belief. So we're all playing that game. And if I sat down with someone like Hitler, or say in my future now, if I met somebody that the society deemed evil, and I sat down with that person, and I have an understanding that that person is a self like me. They may not be self-aware, but they are a self like me, but they're so identified with their consciousness that they can't make that distinction. But I know each person is self, in essence. But that doesn't mean that because I understand that each person is self, each child is self, and then they get conditioned. So, although I know each person is self, when I'm relating to them through consciousness, because consciousness is relationship, and self, the one, that isn't related to the psychophysical or conscious. It's not in relationship. That means it's not in contact. As I say, it does its own thing. If you're looking with compassion at the world, compassion will do its own thing. Whatever that is, it will do its own thing. Obviously, the one is something in the sense it's objectively something. The spiritual perceptions are something. Just like, we walk around and see trees and buildings, but we breathe in the invisible air. The invisible air is what we breathe in, the breath of life. They say the breath of life is the spirit. So if you look at, say, the one as the spirit, I mean, we're all breathing that in to some degree. So you can't say that the one objectively or by implication isn't, you might say, in some way working on the whole field of existence, the whole field of reality. So I can't make that statement. But when I'm in relationship, say, to an evil person, I can't make any, I can't make a special case of that person because I know they're a self. So I have to deal with them in my consciousness, but in communication. And even though I'm looking at them with compassion and understanding, I'm still in relationship with them through my consciousness. So I've met people on my daily walks that maybe are negative or maybe they're positive, and I just listen. So you're listening to someone, and they reveal what they've done and say what they've done breaks the rules of society. Maybe they have done something very so-called evil, and whether they're confessing it to you or they're sharing it with you, or even that they're quite egotistic about it, about how they've done what they've done or got away with it or something like that. But as you're listening objectively, it's like water under a bridge. But in the conversation via consciousness and language, then if you interact, you're interacting with that. Now, as you interact, you have to take on a position, in terms of opposites, duality, good and evil. So, do I take on the position of being, representing my identity as being good? Therefore, I will begin to manipulate the evil person by imposing my sense of goodness. I mean, that's inevitable within the field of consciousness, that you can't not do that, because that's the game you're playing. That's the conditioning, that's the force of karma, the force of conditioning. That's the human condition. The human condition is predicated on the language of that particular group or society or world. The field of knowledge, experience, accumulation of understanding, learning, and all of that. So whether I like it or not, if I begin to actually communicate with that person, then I am in a state of comparison and division and duality. So I can't say, well, I'm spiritually compassionate, which is objective and holistic, and then suddenly I'm in a state of duality. So do I participate in the world, literally speaking, and begin to communicate with people one-to-one in terms of the personality, in terms of my experience and the other person's experience, and relating as two identities, two persons? Or do I keep within myself and not project my my spirituality within the context of society, which when you set up an organisation, by implication, that's exactly what you're doing. You're taking sides. You're setting yourself up as an institution that represents the good, like a charity or something, and then you've got the people that are not good that you're trying to convert, because again, conversion would be implied. You can't be in the relationship within society, within consciousness, without the yin becoming the yang. And that's why you have, within the yin is an element of yang, within the yang is because it's all the same, because ultimately consciousness is made of the same stuff. It's made of language. So when you go A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, everything's implied in everything else. So you can't separate. You can't say there's an evil person or a good person. You can't make that distinction within consciousness on any level. So it is something to think about if you're a spiritually aware person and other people want you to organise that within society. Other people want you to establish the fact that you're a spiritual person within society. And as soon as you do that, you're playing the game. You're on the chessboard, you're playing the game. So that's something for me to think about, I think. I mean, making these videos, I'm still in my own world, as it were. Although I do make comments on other people like Krishnamurti, for example. I've come to a point where, in one sense, I no longer identify with being a spiritual person in the world, as it were, and what to do about the future. Should I become involved or not? And I imagine through the ages that there have been spiritual people who are enlightened that have left no record. I mean, I've left record, I've written books and things, but, there may have been people that didn't leave any record. Because even if you're a spiritual person within the world, within society, you can't make any claim on the one. You can't say, as a spiritual person in society, I'm connected, how can I say, what I'm doing in the world in terms of the organisation, I can't claim that that is connected to the one, like the church does. Like Buddhism will say they're connected to Buddha in some way. No, I think spirituality is about each self. It's a extremely private affair between self and the other, the one, which is not about expressing yourself in society. It's actually not the affair of society. It's not the affair of karma. It's not the affair of language and consciousness and identity. That's the, you might say, that's the inbuilt freedom of the self to discover itself. It's left open, no matter what the world thinks about you. You know, objectively, it's left open for the self to discover the one, or the one to discover the self, because they're the same thing. You know, we grow up as children not knowing we're in the one, and then we become conditioned, we get lost in the world, and maybe even live our whole life and have no sense of self in the objective sense. Although I think every human being does sense their essential self at certain times, in moments of awareness, but I would say primarily very few people actually sustain that connection or contact or pursue it in some way. But of course, to me, the one awakening like that can't be produced by consciousness. It can't be produced by the desire of an identity, or the desire of the personality, the person, in any form. It can't be contacted. I mean, if there's a communication, say Buddha was communicating, the very fact that, say, Buddha was enlightened means that at least there would be a chance that someone might be enlightened because of that person called the Buddha, or the Buddha enlightenment. I mean, it seems likely that's possible. But in terms of the Buddha, we don't know the situation of his own enlightenment. We don't really know that. I think in terms of spiritual perceptions like compassion, like the Bodhisattva and Maitreya, incarnation of love, in other words, those principles, the Bodhisattva being a principle or an archetype, incarnating in yourself, then it seems to me that those perceptions would be perceptible, as it were, by other people. The one not being perceptible, but the perceptions being perceptible at that level of emanation or transmission, what they call grace waves or gift waves. So it is said that can be transmitted, that level of awareness can be transmitted from another realm, as it were, that you're in contact with or that you've embodied, or maybe intelligences on other realms that can transmit into the psyche, into dreams, into a person's life through revelation and things, then yes, it seems to me that there would be a kind of subtle activity involved. Which will probably involve psychophysical energies of some kind. At least psychic, pranic or whatever. Because none of these levels in Tibetan Buddhism of the trikaya, the three bodies of spiritual, psyche and matter, I mean, they're only theoretical because we don't know exactly where they are in terms of location. We can say more or less where the atomic field is and the nuclear field, as it were. But if we go into like parapsychology, the psi field, we can't really say where that is. We can't say where dreams are. In terms of perspective, we can't really say that. But I think, as individually we can, if we're experiencing or understanding the one, and then the idea of spiritual perceptions in extension of the one, and then you might say the kind of level of consciousness in the world, then we can get a sense of levels or sense of how they work. So the one doesn't impose any restriction on yourself as an individual identity in the world. And if you're a spiritual person and you have spiritual perceptions, again, there's no imposition of that onto anybody. They're non-specific and objective to any particular context. They just work holistically, without boundary. They're not bounded by the psyche or the physical, inwardly and outwardly. And they're non-psychological, so you can't like diagnose or you can't analyze. You can't just say, oh, there's an evil person, I'll focus my sense of justice on them or something like that. Or there's a sick person, I'll focus my sense of love on them. But you may be in the presence of someone and maybe something would happen. But it's not a responsibility of a spiritual person in any particular case. It's not taking sides. You don't say, well, I'm going to heal that person and not that person, or something like that. And that's the implicit objectivity and freedom within that level. It's not for yours to decide what to do and what not to do. It's just a living function. It's coming from the life of the one. So within consciousness, people have free choice within that field. And that's allowed to go on, as it were, in terms of history and karma and civilization, and people make of it what they make of it. And that's perfectly, seems to me perfectly all right. And then if the one or the spiritual dimension does anything, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And you just look on, you watch, you perceive, and don't think about it. You're not tracking anything, you're not recording anything, you're not measuring anything, you're not expecting anything. Not protecting anything, you're not supporting anything. So if people decide to become more and more artificial in terms of technology, or people want to remain religious and believe in their institutions, or people want the good life, or people want self-indulgence, etc. That's all part and parcel of human existence. And it's all part of the alchemy of consciousness. It's all part of what it is. I mean, in the same way you look at nature, you can make value judgments on nature, or why does a tiger kill a deer? If there's a creator, why did that creator create that kind of predatory nature which we've inherited? I don't have the answer to that, good and evil and that kind of thing. I mean, the self-nature, as the Zen say, is not the same as human nature.